Hello. We want to. We ended the last time with an interesting and rather provocative discussion, but I found it stimulating actually, because I obviously think that this whole period is very difficult. It's very difficult to go back and try to find out how the world came to war again within 20 years. But I think what's even more difficult is that if you read books like All Quiet on the Western Front and you read books about war during World War I, it's a painful period to have to deal with war. Because I do think that war brings out the worst qualities of man. On the one hand, it brings out the worst qualities of man, Homo sapien. And yet, paradoxically, like everything else we've talked about, it also brings out the finest qualities of people who resist oppression, who resist the effort on the part of people to make them extinct. We looked at some rather graphic pictures of the rape of Nanking yesterday. And that was done simply to give you some idea of the kind of brutality that we have in the world, not just from the Japanese, as I point out, but in the world in general. That man can be so inhuman to his fellow man. But that was just the beginning. The 300,000 or so Chinese who were killed in Nanking was just the beginning of one of a horrific number of people who would die in a few years. Numbers that would dwarf even those of World War I. And I think that, too, as we look at the end of the war, will explain much about the origins, too, of the Cold War. We always say that history, I made the comment earlier, that history doesn't repeat itself. That human nature simply doesn't change. That until man changes his attitudes, he won't be able to change his behavior. And so his behavior will continue to be the same. The difference is that technology, then, when technology improves and increases, it simply makes those tendencies a lot more destructive, as we will see in a moment. But we were looking at I like to call it fatigue on the part of the French and the English. Fatigue from the great losses that they had suffered during World War I. Fatigue from the awful global depression of the 1930s. This fatigue, this war weariness, this world weariness, I think accounts in part for the willingness on the part of France and Britain to allow Germany, to allow Italy to invade Ethiopia in 1935. To allow Hitler during the 30s to virtually ignore and repudiate every provision of the Treaty of Versailles. the rearmament, the moving into the Rhineland, the actual gall to actually repudiate the treaty of 1919 in the League of Nations. This should have been enough to declare war on Germany. But it was clear that this fatigue accounted for a policy of appeasement. And appeasement is simply where you allow, we hope, you will allow people to achieve certain limited goals in foreign policy in the hope that that will satisfy them. So you will appease them. And that is what the British and the French did with Italy, and even more dangerously with Hitler. But it's clear. It was almost clear immediately that appeasement was not going to stop Germany. That Hitler had a grand view of the world, and Hitler was on a course of world domination. That Hitler wanted to remake the world, and nothing was going to sidetrack that. We see Hitler willing to get involved in events not even related to Germany. In 1936, both the Italians and the Germans will furnish significant economic and military provisions to support General Francisco Franco in his overthrow of a democratically elected government in Spain. The Germans and the Italians did not try to hide their support of General Franco. And yet, the West, and particularly Western Europe, stood by and said nothing. They hid behind the veil of neutrality. The overthrow of the democratic government in Spain and the installation of the dictatorship of General Franco will last from 1936 until his death in 1976. A long dictatorship. Americans, even more than the Germans, seemed indifferent to the Spanish Civil War, except for a few Americans. Ernest Hemingway has written about his experiences in the Spanish Civil War. In fact, there were some Americans who actually went to Spain and volunteered to fight on the side of the democratic forces in Spain. The so-called Abraham Lincoln battalions that actually went and fought on the side of the democratic forces in Spain. But in general, though, the great majority of Americans were indifferent to the Spanish Civil War and its possible consequences for world peace. Indeed, Hitler's assessment of both Britain and France's reaction and America's indifference was rooted, his reaction was rooted in his whole perception of America. And really, given, if you understand Hitler's Aryan theories, his Aryan theories of superiority, Hitler could not, he told many of his aides, could not envision the U.S. becoming involved or aroused about anything. He said that America was in fact incapable of conducting any kind of a war, much less a war directed against him at some point in the future. After all, what was America? America was not only a country of mongrels because of the interracial mixing that had characterized American history. Not only was it a country of mongrels, but it was a nasty, dirty, Jewish rubble heap. A nasty, dirty, Jewish rubble heap. What could you expect from a country of mongrels and a Jewish rubble heap? And in fact, he did not think that the U.S. would enter the war, did not have the backbone because of this. And that was a terrible misjudgment on the part of Hitler. And I think what Hitler was probably, he may have been, maybe he was reading newspapers too. And because the newspapers at that time showed a strong isolationist, as we will see in a moment. And this became, again, if you judged by some of the polls, if you judged by some of the speeches of isolationists, one may have gotten the impression that the U.S. would not fight a war. It is just that it takes, as we will see, the U.S. sort of slow to warm up to something, as we saw in World War I. But once they have warmed up to it, they get at it in a big way. And as I indicated, that FDR was clearly an internationalist in the tradition really of his cousin Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelts were internationalists. But he was an internationalist faced with certain realities that he had to contend with that we talked about. It was a problem that even his Secretary of State, who was a Tennessee politician by the name of Cordell Hull. Actually, Hull is the last sort of amateur Secretary of State. He was a judge from Tennessee and a congressman, but really did not have a lot of experience in foreign policy. He was sort of the last of a tradition of sort of amateur Secretary of States. Well, as FDR tried to struggle with how he was going to push America reluctantly to get more involved, because he was personally disturbed about both the invasion of Ethiopia and the Spanish Civil War and the flagrant disregard of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. He also realized that he needed to reassess America's relationship with the Latin American countries. He came to believe that that combination, that the so-called Roosevelt corollary that we talked about, that would still seem to be in effect during the 1920s, that it was time to change that. It was time to cultivate better relationships with America's neighbors south of the United States. And so he will repudiate the Roosevelt corollary. He will repudiate the notion that the U.S. can be the policeman in the Western Hemisphere, or should be its only role should be as a policeman. And he will institute the so-called good neighbor policy with the Latin and South American countries. Actually, he will do this as early as 1933 in his inaugural address. He's always, you could see him very early coming to understand they needed a better relationship. At a conference in Uruguay, he took the opportunity to put in action words that he had given during his inauguration in 1933. He pledged clearly and unequivocally non-American intervention in the Latin and South American states. He will immediately show that these are not simply empty words. He will, in 1933, he will renounce and abrogate the Platt Amendment in Cuba, which had made Cuba since 1901 a quasi-electorate. A quasi-protectorate. Yes.
What was that date?
1933.
1933?
Yes. In 33, he will repudiate the Platt Amendment. Now, obviously, there are those, again, with Cuba, you can't ever seem to be right. When they passed the Teller Amendment, by 1901, they wished they hadn't passed it. Then they passed the Platt Amendment, and by 1933, they wished they hadn't passed it. Then they will renounce it, and then we will see all kinds of problems developing in Cuba by the 40s and 50s, and we'll look at that will lead to America's relationship with Cuba that exists down to this day. Next Monday, the next time we meet, rather. In 1936, he will enter a treaty with Panama, another sore spot in Latin and South American relations, in which the U.S. will give up similar privileges that it had enjoyed since the turn of the century. In 1934, the president will withdraw troops from Haiti, troops that have been stationed for a while in Haiti, and he will also withdraw troops from Nicaragua. But the real test of whether the U.S. was committed to this policy of non-intervention, this good neighbor policy, was tested certainly by Mexico in 1937. Mexico tested America's non-intervention when it decided to nationalize. When it decided to nationalize all of America's oil companies. There were those within America that urged, including Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, urged Roosevelt to retaliate against the Mexican government for the nationalization of American oil companies. But Roosevelt refused. He refused to intervene. He simply saw this as a necessary first step to get people to believe in his new neighbor policy. Well, let's look at Roosevelt and how he will overcome What by the 1930s had become a real thorn in his side and a real problem when it came to pushing America to get more involved in events in Europe and also in Asia. Isolationism reached an all-time high during the 1930s. Isolationism, obviously, if we look at American history, has deep roots, as we discussed. During the 1930s, there was an upsurge in books, in literature, in speeches that expressed great disillusionment with what had happened during World War I. It was not a war to make the world safe for democracy, as Wilson had stated it so eloquently during World War I. It was not that at all, writers claimed during the 30s. But it was a selfish war, a war that had been instigated and contrived, the reasons for it, by American business interests. At the war, the address, the home address for World War I was Wall Street. Okay, it was that sense that business had been responsible for the war. It was not to protect democracy, but to make Wall Street bankers happy and more prosperous. A senator, Russell Nye, conducted a committee which concluded that the war, again, was the result of certain merchants of death. And the word merchants was not simply a play on the word. Or as he put it, quote, to the committee, for the sake of dollars, for the sake of profit, to protect the loans of certain commercial interests in this country, 50,000 American boys now lie buried in France. Actually, that was one of his close allies, Senator Bone of West Virginia, not Senator Nye, who made that comment, but Nye makes one very close to it. By 1937, and look at this statistic, by 1937, 60% of the American people, it's almost scary. Now keep in mind, this is 1937, and look what's happening in Europe, okay? In 1937, 60% of the American people believed that it was a mistake to have gotten involved in World War I. That's a lot. And that's a very difficult thing for Roosevelt to try to navigate through in a period in which you have increasing aggression in Asia, in the Pacific, and in Europe, and yet 60% of the American people in 1937 are saying it was a mistake, a complete mistake, to have gotten involved in World War I. This, too, was, I think, a combination of, we talked about what created the appeasement for the Europeans. I think it was many of those same reasons applied to the U.S. That was a combination of simply fatigue, the Depression had disillusioned Americans, had taken a lot out of the American people. We talked about, again, can you imagine? I mean, You know, sometimes we talk about these things and we don't really try to feel what these things actually mean. Think about for a moment what we just discussed in terms of how devastating the Great Depression was on America and on almost every American, and yet we're expecting them to be what? To have the energy, to have the will to be involved in a war or to be involved in events taking place 3,000 miles from American shores. And they were definitely disillusioned by how the war ended and all of the political mess that came out of the Republicans versus the Democrats in trying to get the treaty passed, and in the end falling squarely on their face. The whole thing, after a while, left a bad taste in the American people's mouths. So you had, by 1937, a very powerful peace coalition of ministers, of college students. In fact, it was said that more than 12 million people by 1937 belonged to this peace movement. What America needed, according to these people, was not battleships. What America needed were schools. Let us turn our eyes inward, they said. If the world is to become a wilderness of waste, hatred, and bitterness, let us all be the more earnestly in protecting and preserving our own oasis of peace and liberty. In other words, let's just take care of ourselves here in America. This peace movement was reflected in Congress. So it wasn't just a handful of radical clergy and a handful of radical students. 12 million people, it's a lot. And some were extremely well known. Charles Lindbergh, first transatlantic flight, was an ardent opponent of internationalism or intervention into Europe. He was a staunch isolationist. And many other well-known Americans opposed getting involved in the affairs of Europe. I mean, remember it sort of reminds me of the Wall Street Journal's, the New York Times' editorial when World War I broke out. And it said that Europe had simply reverted to the state of savages, roaming through the jungle drunk with power and greed. Here again, this use of the word wilderness. If they want to become a wilderness, if they want to kill themselves, and then let them do it. We have an oasis over here that we need to be preserving. Not understanding until almost too late that was more of an illusion than a reality. And 3,000 miles in the modern era was not really a great distance anymore. And that the world, if it had shrunk at the turn of the century, it certainly had shrunk by 1937. So this idea of splendid isolationism didn't work. And yet you had this sentiment. Congress began to pass a series of restrictive neutrality acts, which would tie the president's hands in getting involved in European affairs. In 1933, for instance, in the first of several pieces of neutrality legislation. In this first piece of legislation, Congress denied the president any discretionary power to employ embargoes against aggressive nations. That the president could not on his own, use his own discretionary power to apply an embargo against an aggressive nation. 2 years later, in 1935, Congress is again writing more neutrality legislation. In this one, Congress passed an automatic embargo on American arms and ammunitions to parties at war. Now, this is interesting. This is 1935. We don't have a war yet. We don't have World War II yet. And yet, Congress is now passing legislation that creates an automatic ban, an automatic embargo on American arms and munitions to parties or belligerents at war. Now, does that tell you that maybe perhaps deep down in their gut, some of them felt that it was just what? A matter of time looking at events in the world? And they wanted to make sure that what happened in World War I did not happen in World War II. And the third one, certainly, and this is actually part of the second one. This certainly is reminiscent of what was asked of Wilson in World War I, and Wilson refused. So maybe Congress is trying to make sure this doesn't happen again. It was William Jennings Bryan who said in 1916, when he resigned as Secretary of State, that loans to the Allies was the most unneutral act that he could think of. Now, in 1935, as a part of this second Neutrality Act, not only is there an automatic embargo against arms, but now there's also a ban on loans to countries at war. Is this to prevent the U.S. from getting so involved in, keep in mind, we said that by 1916, with the providing of cargo, arms and munitions to the Allied powers of World War I, and the loans, by 1916, the U.S. could not afford to see what? A Central Power victory. You think perhaps in the back of the mind of some of these congressmen, they were saying, we want to avoid this? And in 1937, the final Neutrality Act was passed by Congress, which banned American ships from war zones. It did more than that. Now, this truly reminds, I think that in a sense, are they trying to avoid? It seems that they're directly trying to avoid what Wilson did, because Wilson vetoed any attempt to do any of these things. Okay? In 1937, the president doesn't have a choice. Congress has now acted that the U.S. ships, American ships, are to avoid war zones. That way, if you're not in a war zone, what? You can't be sunk, or you have less of a chance of being destroyed by belligerents engaged in a war. But keep in mind, this is 1937. We don't have a war yet. But are people thinking war? And Just not. The one thing that Wilson was terribly upset when many of his own cabinet members told Wilson in World War I not to allow Americans to travel on the ships of belligerents. Remember that? And Wilson said, oh no, because to do that would be to sacrifice a sacred right. And that to do that would simply invite more abuses. They don't have a choice in the 1937 Neutrality Act. Americans cannot travel on the ships of belligerents. Yes?
One question I have is, how come the president can't veto these legislative acts on Congress unless once he gave his veto power, they came back with another 2/3 vote out vetoing him?
Well, because FDR was practical, and this was a bipartisan effort. These were not just Republicans voting; these were a lot of Democrats voting for this too as well. Again, it was a congressional sense that they did not want a president dragging him into war. And maybe again, there was this notion that Wilson perhaps had dragged the U.S. into war. They even went so far under the 1937 Neutrality Act that they would not provide oil, steel, rubber, or any of these things needed for war machines to countries who were belligerents. In other words, what Congress tried to do, on the one hand, was tried to avoid repeating the past. But what it ultimately wound up doing was to create a straitjacket which rendered America powerless in being able to move against events that were taking place in the world. It rendered the American people powerless in doing something to prevent the conflagration that clearly seemed to be on a collision course in Europe and in other parts of the world. And in the end, neutrality would be an unequivocal failure. How could it be anything else if we look at what is taking place in the world in hindsight? So Congress's efforts at neutrality would be doomed to fail. But it created all kinds of problems for FDR. How would he get around Congressional Neutrality Acts if, in fact, a war did break out in Europe? Well, but even Roosevelt, and this, I think this also addresses your question. Not only was it a bipartisan effort, but even Roosevelt, this was 1933, 1935, 1937. What was Roosevelt preoccupied with? The Great Depression. And you go even further, that he had, in order to get legislation passed from the doing his New Deal, he had to have support of Congress too as well. So in many ways, while he was aware of events taking place, he was also distracted and preoccupied with trying to save economically his own country. But, like Roosevelt, he still felt he had to see just where the American people were on the issue. How strongly were they committed to non-interventionism and isolationism and neutrality? Following the passage of the 1937 Neutrality Act, he gave a speech in October of 1937 to test the depth of America's isolationist sentiment. And it was one of the great speeches. That a president has made in U.S. history. Roosevelt began by saying, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community. Now, what is Roosevelt talking about here? I mean, are we talking about a smallpox outbreak? The measles? He's obviously talking about what is taking place in Europe. And that he saw it as an epidemic. Hitler's actions, Mussolini's actions, the overthrow of democratic government in Spain. This was an epidemic. This was a disease that would surely spread unless it were what? Unless it were quarantined. And that those patients, I mean, the community had an obligation to quarantine those individuals. Well, if he expected a rousing show of support on the American people, yes, let's get the hypodermic and go to work on them. He was disappointed. I'm not sure he expected, because the speech fell flat. There was virtually no response. And so Roosevelt backed away. Had there been overwhelming support for this kind of aggressiveness, Roosevelt probably would have taken action earlier. But because it was not well received, it was in some quarters criticized, Roosevelt was always attuned to public opinion too, and he backed away, as he did with Social Security when he was up against the wall. He understood there were limits, and he would back off after a while. So he tested the waters, and it was clear that isolationist sentiment was too deep, and so he backed away. And he said this to his friend. I mean, one of his friends, after he had given a speech, and he had hoped to see this outpouring of support from the American people. But instead he said, boy, it's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder when you're trying to lead and find no one there. It's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder when you're trying to lead and find no one there. That is kind of a lonely feeling. In a sense, in 1938, Americans were sitting on their collective derrieres, from the sidelines, watching events unfolding inexorably in Europe. They sat and they watched while Germany pushed Europe to the brink of war. Hitler, now more brazen than ever, told the German people that its problems could not be solved by negotiations or treaties, that the only way that you could solve Germany's problems, he told Germany, was by force and force alone. You can't get much clearer than that. In March, the Germans marched. I got tongue-tied. In March, Germany forced the Austrian government into a union with Germany in 1938. In the fall of 1938, Hitler again is moving. He threatened the country of Czechoslovakia if they didn't turn over land that he said actually belonged to the Germans by their birthright, a land called the Sudetenland. And then after he took this land, then he made the comment that this is the last territorial claim that I have to make in Europe. Geez. This is the last territorial claim I have to make in Europe. And the Czechs agreed. Well, they really didn't. You know, I can just imagine them saying, yeah, right, but what choice do we have at this point? But even if you could understand the Czechoslovakian response, but what about England? I mean, he's already forced Austria into joining with the German government. Now he's taken a part of Czech land. And the British Prime Minister Chamberlain applauds it. He applauds it. He feels relieved that Germany has said that this is the last territorial claim that I have to make in Europe. He wants to believe it so badly that he will comment that that's wonderful. With that, we will have peace in our time. And all the while, Hitler is just laughing. But Winston Churchill, who will replace Chamberlain, knew better. And he soon replaced Chamberlain, and he said this about what had happened in both Austria and Czechoslovakia, and the fact that England did not move to oppose Germany. He said that, quote, Britain and France have chosen between dishonor and war. They chose dishonor. They will have war. Now that's a very insightful comment, that it was a choice between dishonor and war. In other words, dishonor will not get you out, will not avoid a war. That he knew that this was just the beginning for Hitler. That the countries had chosen dishonor, and that dishonor was the most certain way to have a war. And Churchill was absolutely correct. Within 6 months after he had had enough, after he made the comment, I have all I need, I have all I want, the Germans then completed the complete conquest of Czechoslovakia. Apparently, they didn't get as much as they thought they had. Columns of German troops poured into the Czech border. It clearly smashed any notions that appeasement would work with Germany. And what about the Russians? The Russians now were wondering what is going on. Would Hitler turn in their direction? The Russians had never forgotten that the Germans had twice before tried to invade Russia. In 1812, the French had tried to invade. Russia was always very conscious of being invaded. And they soon thought that Hitler might turn its attention to them. But in order to play for time, to help begin to build up its military, Germany seduced Russia with the 1939 non-aggression pact. That they signed the 1939 non-aggression pact between Germany and Russia. In other words, Germany promised, and they promised each other that they would not attack one another. Yes.
Was this so that Germany had time to rebuild its army, or Russia had time?
Well, actually, I think it was Germany was not quite ready. It would not be ready. It always had intentions of invading Russia when it does it in 1941. It's just, on the one hand, they both need time to get ready for one another. I think the Russians knew it was coming, but they simply had to go along with it. The Germans simply said, we'll give them a little bit more time, but we're definitely coming. And it only lasts 2 years. I mean, because in 41 he will invade Russia. And it really does not give Russia enough time really to prepare. 2 years is not a lot of time. But they knew, in a sense, both knew what was coming. I'm not sure what to compare it with. I was going to think about a fight, but how you put off a fight till, you say, well, in school with two guys, they say, well, let's fight now. Then they put it off and say, well, let's wait till after school. And then after school, they say, well, let's do it Saturday. But eventually, if there's enough hostility between you and that person, that sooner or later, it's going to come. And you try to look for some advantage. At least I always should try to. There's never really any advantage in the end. Well, the Germans also sweetened the pot for the Russians. The Russians had always wanted this too. As we'll see, it becomes a real factor in the Cold War. It's part of its historic need for security. The Germans will allow, the Russians and the Germans will agree on a partition of Poland to break Poland up. Well, Russia was now frantically trying to get ready for war. Germany was as happy as it could be with the non-aggression pact with Russia because it would keep Russia out for a while it now put the second phase of its plan into action. On September the 1st, 1939, the Germans unleashed its army. I'm trying to find it. Well, I don't have it. Well, it unleashed its army on Poland. A new type of warfare called lightning war. The Blitzkrieg. Lightning war in which in a very short period of time they poured 1.5 million German soldiers into Poland. 1.5 million German soldiers in an incredibly short period of time. 1939, September the 1st. It was called the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. He told his soldiers before they went in. He addressed his soldiers and told them before they invaded Poland, he said to them to close your heart to any pity. He told them to act brutally. And that was his instruction to his soldiers. To close your heart to any pity, but to act brutally. About 2 weeks, a very short period of time, is incredible. But of course, the Germans created an incredible war machine. You have to give them credit for that in the end. 2 days later, having appeased the Germans, having put this off as long as they could, the Allies in Europe had no choice, and they declared war on Germany. Britain, France now will declare war on Germany, and for the second time in 20 years, World War II has begun. This time, this war is more savage and more destructive. When the war is over, the world would never ever be quite the same. Not Europe and not even America. Yes.
So in the beginning, it was just Britain and France that declared
Yes.
war?
Yes, don't forget, the Russians are still in the non-aggression pact. In the Pacific, the Germans, the Japanese are not in the war, but they're moving quickly toward war with the U.S. So, and the U.S. is not a part of this. Italy has joined the Germans. So Italy has joined the Germans. So, and those are the principal powers at this point. Well, what about American involvement? Again, sometimes this almost seems repetitious to every war we talk about. In 1939, when war breaks out, the Americans are naturally sympathetic with the Allies. And whether they believe it or not, the Americans will articulate this notion that they believe that the Allies can handle it by themselves. That they don't really need the U.S.'s help. Okay? I mean, that is a rationalization. That is where you get around, again, responsibility for getting involved in the war. In April, Hitler, who has now taken Poland, in April of 1939, it will now attack and overrun Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium. This was a war machine that was really, this lightning war machine was incredible. It even bottled up, it even threatened to completely decimate the French troops at a place called Dunkirk in 1939, the French port of Dunkirk. The Germans had surrounded the French, and only the British, the tenacity and bravery of the British saved many of the French troops in Dunkirk. In fact, the British were able to rescue 330,000 French troops. But though they rescued 330,000 French troops, the French had to abandon, because I don't know why they didn't blow it up. You generally destroy. You don't leave weapons for the enemy. But they had to leave so quickly because the Germans were on them so fast that they left behind 90,000 rifles, 7,000 tons of ammunition, 120,000 vehicles. That is a lot of war material to leave behind. The French, with its vaunted 800,000 standing man army, which was supposed to be able to repel anything the Germans could throw at them, particularly since they had constructed the elaborate defense called the Maginot Lines. that with 800,000 troops, they would be able to repulse any German attack. The French fell in an incredibly short period of time. 800,000 man army. By May 15th, we're talking about April and May, within a month, the French call Churchill and they tell Churchill, we have been defeated. If that is not bad enough to add insult to injury, the French will surrender to the Germans in the same boxcar, railroad boxcar, that the Germans were forced to surrender to them at the end of World War I. Hitler's reaction to the defeat of the French, some have described, was almost hysterical. It was a combination of joy, but hatred, scorn, contempt, and loathing for the French. That's a lot to experience in one moment. Hate, scorn, contempt, revenge, and triumph, all in the same moment. He will now install, Hitler, a puppet government in a town called Vichy, because it becomes known as the Vichy government. Winston Churchill will announce to his country that the Battle of France is over. And I must tell you that if you read accounts of this, it's almost as if people are in a state of shock. No one believed that the Germans could defeat the French so quickly. Maybe could defeat them in a long war, but between April and May 15th, people were absolutely stunned. Americans were stunned. They could not believe it. Churchill believed it. As Churchill told his own country, he said, the Battle of France is over. I suspect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. And he was absolutely right. Once they had installed the puppet government at Vichy, the Germans now unleashed everything they had against Britain itself. The Germans unleashed its dreaded Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, on the British people. Night after night, the Battle of Britain, night after night, more than 250 German planes bombed the British. What was the Americans? What now could the Americans do? Well, FDR simply abandoned any pretense of neutrality. He committed as much as he could American policy. The American policy was to support their allies with everything they could short of war. He immediately offered the British 50 World War I vintage destroyers. Now, keep in mind that he is doing this to get a... Now, let me explain this. It's not that simple. You have these neutrality acts which which prohibit this, right? So he tries something a little different. He calls it lend-lease. He will lend the British 50 vintage World War I destroyers in exchange for leasing 8 of their military bases. Well, in the first place, why would the U.S. need to lease 8 of the military bases unless they were clearly, this is clearly a way to get around the Neutrality Act. But Congress also know what's coming. If their head was in the sand as an ostrich, believe me, it was out now. Congress would appropriate very quickly $8 billion to rearm the nation. Congress senses too that their road is getting shorter. Not only will they authorize $8 million to build up the American armed forces, they will also now institute the first peacetime draft. That is, before they are in the war. They had a draft in World War I, but the war had already started. This is the first peacetime draft. First, it would be all eligible men, 20 years. You had to be 20 years or over, but soon they will lower it to 18. Well, while he is trying to support the Allies, he is faced in 1940 with a presidential election. He will run against Wendell Willkie, the Republican. Well, he will fairly easily beat Willkie. And once he has beaten him, he will turn his attention again to the war. The lend-lease policy of Roosevelt will provide the British with valuable war material. He also will urge the U.S. that it has a role to play in this war, even though they are not committing troops. And that is, America is to be the arsenal of democracy. The arsenal of democracy. Well, all was not that easy, because you had still some diehard isolationists who tried to derail Lend-Lease, who tried to derail many of these efforts. Lend-Lease, one opponent called it, was sort of like lending gum, chewing gum to a friend. You really don't want it back. Another opponent called his Lend-Lease program another version of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. He called it the Agricultural, the AAA Grim Reaper Act, that it would plow one of every 6 American boys under the ground, because eventually it would bring them into war with the Germans. Well, and they denied the isolationists that Hitler posed a direct threat to American security. Again, this notion that because America is 3,000 miles away, somehow, it can't touch them. Well, as this is taking place, of course the Germans will dispatch this notion anyway, that it can't touch them, because the Germans will begin to sink American ships. They will sink the Kearney, they will sink the Reuben, and they will sink the Reuben James. This is fine, too, with Roosevelt. Actually, not that he was happy about the American ships being sunk, but when the Germans did sink these American ships, Congress now felt that it had no choice but to repeal all of the legislation, the neutrality legislation they had passed in 1933, 1935, and 1937. All neutrality legislation was now passed, which now will give the President and Congress a free hand to deal with Germany when the time comes. Well, what is taking place in the Pacific? In the Pacific now, after the bombing of the Panay in December 1937, the U.S. will not really accept the Japanese apologies, nor even their attempt to pay reparations for the loss of several lives. They will continue and begin to harden their position against the Japanese. They will continue, for instance, to refuse to recognize the Japanese claim to Chinese territory, infuriating the Japanese even more. The truth is, at this point in time, because the U.S. had not truly built up its military force throughout the entire Pacific, the U.S. does lack enough military power to challenge in 1937 the Japanese in East Asia. Certainly militarily they can't challenge them. The only way that the U.S. can challenge and hurt the Japanese and try to persuade them to abandon their course of expansion is to use economic power, to use American economic power. That is their only effective weapon. Because the Japanese depended on a long list of resources from the Americans. And these were not just resources, they were strategic resources, especially the resource of oil that we talked about. Steel, but in the end, that was a whole laundry list of things they needed from the U.S., but in the end, the most critical resource would be oil. Remember what the British said right after World War I, that oil would be as precious as blood in the next war. And indeed, the Japanese needed oil. So Roosevelt had, beginning in the early 30s, all the way up to 1938, had sort of engaged in a kind of balancing act with the Japanese, using economic leverage, denying them certain goods at certain times to sort of tame Japanese aggression. But not enough to do what? Not enough to provoke the Japanese to outright war. Okay, just enough to hurt them, but not enough to make them desperate. Well, at the same time, America seemed distracted by what was taking place in Europe. But by 1939, this balancing act didn't work anymore. In 1939, the U.S. gave the Japanese an ultimatum. Ceased their aggression, or else. The Japanese said, or else what? And then they went ahead and took bases in Indochina. The Americans then replied with almost a blanket embargo over, as you pointed out, iron, steel, and scrap iron. It also responded to the American threat by joining the Germans in what was called the tripartite pact of September 1939 with Germany, Italy, and now Japan. And this was essentially, this essentially said that if any of the countries were attacked by a country not presently in the war at that time, they would come to their aid. Well, what country was not presently involved in the war at that time. No, it's Japan signing this with Russia. I'm sorry, with Italy and with Germany. Now they're saying that if they are attacked by a country not presently in the war at the time, then they would join to protect them. The only country that wasn't in the war was the U.S. This was directed at the U.S., and the U.S. knew it. Well, the U.S. then will take the final steps that will lead to war with the Japanese, and we'll look at the consequences of World War II when we come back.